This next section, titled Thinking Vertically, encompasses a couple of different approaches. Number one, the vertical approach, as we explored in the last chapter, was a physical sense of navigating or negotiating the fretboard in a way that moves within position across the strings. But we can also think vertically through the harmony. And what that means is thinking chord upon chord. So in the context of a standard jazz progression, which usually features a 2-5-1, instead of thinking about one scale that fits over all three chords, kind of a blanket approach, we're really going to pinpoint the sound of each individual chord. So really outlining the sound of the 2 chord, outlining the sound of the 5 chord, outlining the sound of the 1 chord. So even though a major scale, whether you're thinking of the 2 chord working with Dorian, 5 chord with Mixolydian or whatever, they all belong to the major scale. We're really focusing on the chord tones of each chord. So outlining the triad and 7th chord, and then even some extensions to create some color later on. So let's take a look at what I mean by all of this. In example 1, we have a G major scale, just a very typical G major scale fingering. Here it is. Now, example 2 takes the same fingerings, the same fingering and the same notes, but extracts the chord tones. So, for example, if we were just to pull out the 1, 5, 7, and 3 of each of those, it would be outlined in example 2, G major 7 chord tones. Now, if we were to do that for all 3 chords, in the context of a 2-5-1 progression, those 3 chords would be A minor 7, D7, and G major 7. So example 3 illustrates extracting the chord tones for each individual chords in the progression, still using this same fingering. And it looks and sounds like this. Here's example 3, A minor 7, D7, and then G major 7. So you'll notice that all of the notes that we just played there are found in the scale pattern from example 1. But the difference is we're thinking vertically and we're playing vertically, meaning we're outlining the chord tones of each individual chord. And this will be the difference of whether you can play through changes convincingly or not. In other words, if you can outline the sound of one chord simply by playing single note lines, it will be quite an incredible difference in your improv. So example 4 gives you an idea of how thinking of just a scale pattern won't work quite as effectively as if you really outline each change by thinking vertically. So here's example 4. If this were played in the context of a 2-5-1 progression, you're using the notes of G major, but it doesn't really sculpt out the sound of each individual chord. Here it is. Let's take a listen to it in time. 1, 2, 3, and... So I'm just playing a simple line based on a G major scale, and it wouldn't sound wrong or incorrect or bad over example 4 if you were to play the chords behind that, playing a 2-5-1. But when you hear it by itself, it doesn't necessarily sculpt out or infer the changes within a 2-5-1. But now check out example 5. We're playing the same notes, but we're going to focus on the individual chord tones of each chord change, the 2-5-1, within the same region, the same position. So here's example 5. 1, 2, 3, and... Now you can really hear each individual chord in time, and there's no rhythm guitar behind me, there's no bass line, but yet you get this sense of movement from the 2 chord to the 5 chord and then resolving to the 1 chord based on how you phrase the notes of this one major scale, the simple G major scale. So the next step would be combining the regions that we did in the previous chapter in the toolbox and work out all of those regions and start connecting from one chord to the next. And this is illustrated in example 6. We're going to start out with one particular region of A minor 7 and then work into an inversion or a region of D7 and then resolve that to G major 7. So here it is in time. A 1, 2, 3, and... So it's not a very exciting musical example, and it sounds a little dry in terms of outlining the chord tones in one sense. But on the other hand, it's really effectively outlining the chord change. So again, even though we're using only the notes of G major, the way that we're phrasing it to think vertically and outline each individual chord is very effective in setting up this sound of movement from one chord to the next, this cadence. Let's take a look at a concept called neighbor tones. If we start off with chord tones, for example, in a triad, the chord tones would be 1, 3, and 5. We can play what are called neighbor tones that surround or live right next door to each of these 3 chord tones. So for the 1, there's a neighbor tone that's both above and below that tonic, as well as below and above the 3rd and the 5th. So example 7, we have our fingering for a G major triad, and again, these are just 1, 3, and 5 of G, so we have 2 G triads, and then a 3rd above that. In example 8, we can look at the lower neighbor tones of each chord tone. Now with lower neighbor tones, those will always be a half step below the chord tone. So in example 8, we're going to approach each of the chord tones of G major by a half step below, and here it is. Example 9 shows a lower neighbor tone form for a minor chord. So again, now that we're focusing on the chord tones of 1, flat 3, and 5, we're still going to approach each of those chord tones by a half step below for the lower neighbor. So here's example 9. Example 10 now illustrates upper neighbor tones. Now upper neighbors are a little different. Lower neighbors will always be a half step below the chord tone, but upper neighbors may be a half or a whole step above the chord tone based on the overall parent scale. So for example, just to give you a quick definition of this, in the context of a G major scale, we have 1 that goes up to a whole step above that, the 2. So that would be a whole step upper neighbor since that's the next note in the scale. So the upper neighbor above 1 would be a whole step. Now if we look at the 3rd, the next note in the scale above that is a half step above that. It's the 4th. So in that case, the upper neighbor will be a half step above the 3rd. And then when we go forward to the 5th, the next note in the scale is a whole step, a 6th. So that upper neighbor will be a whole step. So in the case of a major triad, we have 2 whole step upper neighbors. And those are illustrated in example 10. These are upper neighbors approaching the notes of a G major triad. Here we go. Example 11 illustrates what we can call double neighbors, and this is a pattern that basically surrounds each chord tone, the 1, 3, and the 5, by their respective lower and upper neighbors. And you get some really cool sounding patterns using this concept. As is mentioned in the text, Mozart loved using this device. It's a great orchestration device. Some people would call it filler, but it's a great way to create some momentum and some velocity in your lines. Joe Pass and Django Reinhardt both loved playing lines using these double neighbor approaches. So let's take a look at example 11 and work through the double neighbors for each chord tone. Here we go. So with each chord tone, we're starting with an upper neighbor, chord tone, lower neighbor, chord tone. And that's one of a lot of different patterns that you can come up with, but this is a very popular pattern. And it's a great way of outlining a particular chord sound without using a scale at all. Example 12 takes a look at some different regions, now this time using a C major. So if we were using this chord form, we can extract the triad arpeggio and approach each of those notes in the triad arpeggio with the lower neighbors. So again, we're thinking a half step below each chord tone. So here's example 12. So you can just think of that C triad arpeggio approached by a half step below. And it's important to see the shape of the triad while you're playing this. You're just approaching it a half step below. We can also do this with a minor chord form, as we see in example 13. Now we're outlining a D minor chord. This is a different region. We'll start by approaching the fifth by a half step below, but here it is. And by the way, I think it's helpful, to actually play these with two fingers, almost kind of like in a Django Reinhardt style of just using the first and middle fingers. It's a lot easier to use those two fingers playing these types of lines rather than trying to, navigate between all four fingers. It's actually easier just to stick with a couple. And to that end, a lot of Gypsy or Roma style players will finger a lot of these arpeggios and neighbor tone lines using only the first two fingers, just as Django would, because it sounds a lot nicer. There's a great momentum and forward motion that's created, and physically it's a lot easier actually in this case. Now examples 14 and 15 outline a 2-5-1 progression using the concept of these lower neighbors and then double neighbors. So example 14 just works through a vertical approach of each chord, basically again outlining the triad and seventh chord in some cases with a lower neighbor step, lower neighbor tone a half step below. Example 15 uses a double neighbor approach, kind of like a Joe Pass and a Django Reinhardt approach to playing a 2-5-1, and it very effectively outlines the changes. If we look forward to examples 16, 17, and 18, again, we're outlining a 2-5-1 progression using a vertical approach. And each one just adds a little bit more color using substitutions. So for example, 16 pretty much sticks to the 4-note arpeggio for each chord. So D minor, that's one region of your D minor 7. So now you can extract a line out of that just by adding some rhythm and space. And then we're outlining a G7 and then resolve to a C major. Example 17 takes it a step further by adding a little bit of color. In the first bar, we outline a ninth with the D minor 7, so adding the E on top of the D. Now we're going to outline the sound of an altered G7, G7 flat 9, flat 5, by really outlining kind of a D flat 7 chord. well within that shape, but we're going to play that over the G sound, and it's going to sound like a G altered. And then that will resolve to a C major, just like we did in example 16, but again add a little bit more color by adding and resolving the F sharp leading into the last bar. And that will give us kind of a C major 7 sharp 11 sound. Example 18 adds some chromaticism or some half-step motion, some passing tones within the context of thinking vertically. So in the first bar of example 18, we're basically outlining this D minor 7 sound, but we have some chromatic passing tones within that. So in the first bar, we're chromatically connecting the 9th and the root. Then we go back down to the 7th and 5th, but chromatically approaching the 3rd, which is the B in the next bar of the B, which is the 3rd of G7. And then we land right on that B to make it sound like a G7 chord. And then we add a chromatic note with the A flat functioning as a flat 9 over the G. And then we do the same thing. We chromatically approach the E in the 3rd bar. And then we can just finish off with a nice chromatic line, connecting the 7th up to the 9th. Now let's take a look at extracting arpeggios, which you can also think of vertical, a vertical structure out of a major scale pattern, or any scale pattern for that matter. Example 19 illustrates a C major scale, again a very common scale fingering that we use for major, but here it is, C major scale, example 19. In example 20, we see how we can extract an E minor 7 arpeggio right out of that same scale form. So you'll notice in the notation and in the tab, the notes that are in the parentheses are the notes that are not in an E minor 7, and the notes basically we're accenting, or we're really focusing on the notes that create an E minor 7. So let me just play this scale again, and we'll focus on the notes within an E minor 7 arpeggio. So there's a C. There's the D, which is the flat 7 of E. There's our E, the root, parentheses for the F. There's the G, which is the flat 3rd of E minor, pass through the A. There's a B, which is the 5. Chord tone, chord tone, chord tone, chord tone. So in example 21, we can just extract only those 4 notes for the E minor 7 arpeggio and play them as such. Right out of that same C major scale pattern. When we do that, we are creating the sound of a C major 9 chord, because if we look at each of the notes of E minor 7 as a chord tone relating to C major 7, E is the 3rd, G is the 5th, B is the 7th, and D is now the 9th, if we're thinking of C as the new root. So this is, some people call this an upper structure sound, an upper structure of C major 9, but it's with our vertical way of thinking, we're superimposing an E minor 7 over a C major. And by thinking of E minor 7, we're just keeping things real easy. It's very simple to think about, especially after you've practiced all of the regions and inversions we have worked through in previous chapters. These will just be second nature to you by now. So playing an E minor 7 in any region of the neck will be a piece of cake. Now the next step is to think of that and superimpose that over C, which will give you a C major 9 sound. So then, you may want to reinforce your E minor 7 inversions by practicing through the 4 regions, just like we did in previous chapters. So example 22 illustrates the 4 regions of E minor 7, all of which can be used over C major 7 to create a C major 9 sound. So here's example 22. Second region, third region, and fourth region. So you have this concept of duality happening. You're playing, obviously, an E minor 7 arpeggio in these different regions, and you're cognizant of that, but you're also thinking that it totally relates and works superimposed over C major. And that's just something with a little bit of practice. But the point being is that if you see a chord chart with the chord symbol C major 7, you can substitute E minor 7 ideas and all of these, extract lines out of all of these different regions to create really interesting sounds, as opposed to just playing ideas based on the C major scale, or having that as your template to work with over C major. Now you're thinking E minor 7 ideas over the C major, and as a result, your lines will be a little bit more comfortable and sound a little bit more unique because of the way that you're phrasing. Example 23 continues this concept, but now superimposing a major 7 arpeggio over a minor 7 chord. So example 23 features an E flat major 7 arpeggio. And if you superimpose that over C, the result is a C minor 9 sound. So then the next step would be to reinforce your knowledge of the 4 regions of major 7. And specifically E flat major 7, those regions are illustrated in example 24. So here's example 24, the regions of E flat major 7, which will all work over C minor. Region 1. Region 2. Region 3. And finally, region 4. So again, you realize that they're major 7 regions, but you're also mindful that you're thinking of C minor 7. So these will all work beautifully over that. In example 25, we can take a look at what we'll superimpose over a dominant sound. In this case, an E minor 7 flat 5 arpeggio will work over a C7 chord, creating a C9 sound. So if we just look at one of the regions for E minor 7 flat 5, example 25 looks like this. But over C, it will sound like a C9 like you would use in a blues. Now let's take a look at how this vertical thinking or superimposing arpeggios over a different root will work in the context of a chord progression. Example 26 takes 2 chords, C major 7 and F major 7, and superimposes different arpeggios or lines extracted from these arpeggios over them. So over C major 7, we're going to be thinking in E minor 7. For the F major 7 chord, you'll be using an A minor 7. So you'll notice there's formulas here that you can learn to memorize. With a major 7 chord, you can use a minor 7 arpeggio or minor 7 idea up a third, the third of that chord. So with a C major 7, the third is an E, and that's where you'll base your minor 7 ideas from. So you just think up to the third. So when we move to F major 7, the third of F is A, so now you'll be using A minor 7 ideas all over F. The same concept is happening in example 27. Now we're using 2 minor 7 chords, C minor 7 and F minor 7. But again, we're using major 7 ideas built on the thirds of each. So over a C minor 7 chord, we'll use ideas on E flat major 7. And on F minor 7, we'll be taking ideas from an A flat major 7 arpeggio. Example 28 features 2 dominant 7th chords. So the formula for that will be using a minor 7 flat 5 arpeggio or half diminished 7 arpeggio on the third of the chord. So if we have C7, The third of that C will be an E, so we'll use an E minor 7 flat 5. And then when you move to the F7, the third of that chord is A, which you will then use A minor 7 flat 5. So the good news is, it seems like a lot of thinking, but the good news is once you've practiced all of these different regions and inversions, they will all be second nature. So you'll very easily be able to switch between E minor 7 flat 5 and A minor 7 flat 5 between these examples. So example 28 superimposes half diminished 7 arpeggios and regions over 2 dominant 7th chords. Now we can also use this concept with altered dominant 7th chords. Example 29 shows how a B flat minor 7 flat 5 arpeggio will outline a C7 altered. So here's example 29. You'll recognize that from the regions in the previous chapter, those would be the half diminished 7th regions. In this case, it's built on the flat 7th of the dominant 7th chord. So if our chord is C7, the flat 7 of that would be B flat. So B flat is where we'll start our we'll think vertically, we'll start our superimposition from that. So if we were to compare the notes of a B flat minor 7 flat 5 arpeggio against a C, we have flat 7, flat 9, giving us that altered sound, 3, sharp 5, flat 7. So by itself, it sounds like a minor 7 flat 5 arpeggio, but when you superimpose that over a C, in this case, it sounds like, an altered chord. And that's demonstrated in the next example. Example 30 shows, it illustrates a 2-5-1 in the key of F, so the 5 chord is now C. And over the C7 altered chord, we're extracting notes from that B flat minor 7 flat 5 arpeggio to really give us a nice C7 altered sound. And then that resolves to an A minor 7 idea on the F major 7 chord to give it, just a nice colorful sound of F major 9.